open source and Nvidia have never really had the closest of relationships. It's much better than it used to be with the open source GPU kernel modules, which have not been upstream, but they are used by the proprietary driver, and they are taking Wayland problems seriously, although addressing them quite slowly. But I'm sure you've all seen the ancient Linus Torvalds picture. I still love it to this day. And the driver space has a lot of interesting things going on, because of course you have the proprietary Nvidia drivers, where the user space, even though the kernel space is open source, the user space part is still proprietary. But there are some third-party, community-driven open source projects out there. The most notable and long-running project is the Nouveau project. This has been around in some form since about 2005. When you go to a distro and it gives you the option of the open source Nvidia drivers, take Linux Mint for example, that is what it is going to be using. And thanks to recent-ish changes around the handling of the GSP firmware, which is actually handling the GSP firmware, they are now viable to use again on the post-20 series GPUs. For a period, it was literally unusable because the drivers couldn't control the clock of the card, so it would run at minimum clock, which meant minimum speed, which meant you could get a video signal through these cards. And that's about all they were good for, because the cards were basically expensive paperweights. That problem has now been resolved, and the drivers are actually usable again. But there is another project more recently in the works, and especially if you say it as Nouveau, it has a very annoyingly similar name. That is the Nova project. So Nova and Nouveau, or if you pronounce it as Nouveau, it's less of an issue. This was announced by Red Hat engineer Danilo Krumrich back in March of 2024. This is a Rust-based driver primarily aiming for support for the post-GSP GPUs. So if you're using an older card, like say, I don't know, 600 series, for example, you'd want to be looking at the Nouveau project if you want to have support with the open source drivers. Currently, it is still very, very early. It is not production ready. If you're going to be using it, it's basically just there for the developers to be using. And the initial boilerplate framework code was upstreamed back in the 6.15 kernel in March. Even to this day, though, it is still a very long way from actually being a driver that you or I are going to want to use. But it is progressing. And what I'm here to talk about today happened about 2 weeks ago, but I still think it's worth talking about because it is actually really interesting. So there have been people working on this project for quite a while now. Most of the work is done by Danilo because that's the primary maintainer. That's usually how it goes in the FOSS world. But there have been other contributors here and there along the way. And back in April, there was a very interesting name that showed up. Alexander Corbott. And this was a totally normal patch set. It was a 16-piece patch set, I believe. And yes, there was some discussion about, hey, here's something we could do a little bit better, maybe change this to this thing, maybe do this in a slightly different way, but nothing in the way of arguments and debate about the correct way to do things, more about just, hey, we want to do it in this way, this might be a better way to do it, things like that. And overall, good patch set, ended up being merged. Now, you might not know the name of this person, but you do know their employer, Nvidia. Now, this video isn't about some random patch set from April where absolutely nothing happened. It's a totally smooth patch set, no drama whatsoever. Instead, I want to talk about what happened more recently. Maintainers add Alexander Corbott as co-maintainer to Nova Core. Alex has extensive experience with Nvidia GPU support, is closely involved in Nova Core development, and brings valuable Rust expertise. In addition to his technical contributions, Alex is actively engaged with the broader community. He works closely with contributors and stakeholders to identify and solve issues, fosters collaboration, and helps ensure that the Nova driver evolves in alignment with the community. I trust him to take a key role in making the Nova driver a successful upstream solution for Nvidia GPUs in the Linux kernel. And under that post he replied, "Thanks Dinalo for your trust and for guiding us to this point. It is still a long road ahead, but I'm happy and excited to be involved in this effort with you and the community." Act by Alexander Korber. I don't know why he bothered to act it, because I assume the discussion happened beforehand, and look, it's a written record of it, right? Like, you wouldn't just spring, "Hey, you're the co-maintainer now," just on somebody in the mailing list. You would have that discussion in private first. Now, he's not the only Nvidia employee involved in the project. John Hubbard here is also from Nvidia. But having an Nvidia employee not just working on the third-party driver, but also being a co-maintainer on that open source driver, this is really big for that project, especially early on as it's trying to gain legitimacy as a real driver solution. And this is not actually the first time it has happened, but the notable case happened in the other direction. The now former maintainer of the Nouveau project resigned from the position in late 2023, but from then on, continued just working on the project, just wasn't in a maintainer position anymore. And then at one point, there was a patch set he submitted, and people noticed a change in his email. It wasn't his old one anymore. Now it was at Nvidia.com, and these emails are only given to Nvidia employees. And if you look at the commit log, there are still consistent changes being made by Ben Skeggs, and if we go to this one right here, and we look at the email, he is still an employee at Nvidia.com. So he went from being a just maintainer on Nouveau, from there, directly hired at Nvidia, continued working on the Nouveau project. Now, I can't speak for any private details of Ben's contract or Alex's contract, but with the fact that Ben was literally hired at Nvidia from being the maintainer on the Nouveau project, and the fact that none of this is private, they're using their Nvidia email address and John Hubbard and various other people from Nvidia who are working on Nouveau and Nova. Nvidia is well aware that this work is going on, and it would be a totally normal contract to say, "Hey, whilst you're employed at Nvidia, you can't work on a third-party driver project, a community driver project. That's just not allowed," right? Like, that's totally normal. As an example with Asahi Linux, they don't let Apple people anywhere near the project because they know that Apple is going to just, try to destroy the project. But in this case, at an absolute bare minimum, Nvidia doesn't care that their engineers are working on a third-party driver project, right? Like, they're okay with that. And best case scenario, some of their official duties are actually endorsed by Nvidia and they are paid to do that work. This is my prediction just based on the way I'm seeing this play out. Nvidia is sort of testing the waters with an open source driver. They don't want to fully commit to anything. They don't want to go and make their driver open source, even though that is something they could very well go and do. And they've got those open source kernel modules. All they would need to do on the kernel side is develop them in an open source way, bring them in line with kernel coding standards, and, yes, that would take a lot of work, but they could go and do that if they wanted to do so. Same with their user space driver. They could make it open source if they wanted to. Or what they could do is see how these open source driver projects go. Allow their engineers to go and work on those projects. Don't bar them from it just because they're employed at Nvidia. Let them go and get involved with those projects if they want to. Even go and hire engineers who were working really actively on a project like Nouveau and allow them to continue doing that as an official employee at Nvidia. It lets them provide some level of resources to these projects, but not to an extent like AMD, where the Linux drivers that everybody uses for AMD are the open source drivers. AMD is fully committed to supporting these drivers, going so far as slowly stripping things out of the proprietary drivers and moving more towards the open source side. Whereas Nvidia is sort of just giving some resources here and there, allowing their engineers to work on it, and just sort of watching at a distance, seeing how they go. And at some point, if they progress further, if they get to a very positive state, I could see a world where Nvidia sort of says, okay, well, these drivers are really good. We've deprecated all of the GPUs that aren't supported on these drivers anyway. Let's say 10 years from now, when everything is post-GSP, then they could say, okay, well, now let's go all into these open source drivers because now they're in a good enough state. Now we don't necessarily need to have this proprietary stack as the main thing. We can get some brownie points. We can, promote how much we love open source, but let the open source community do most of the work as we watch it get there. So let me know, do you think I'm cooking or do you think I'm cooked? Tell me down below, what do you think? Do you think there's some, not necessarily malicious ulterior motive here, but do you think Nvidia is just letting their engineers work on this as a way to test the waters? I'd love to know. So if you liked the video, go like the video. If you really like the video and you want to become one of these amazing people over here, check out the Patreon, Scribe, Silly Barapay, linked in the description down below. That's gonna be it for me, and get cooked.